So this is a talk that kind of tells you what you can expect. I've got about 9 lessons that I think will help you have a nice long future as a designer. They're things that happened to me, so I know them firsthand, and I'm going to show you how I dealt with them. But let me just start right into it and take you through it. This is a staircase about how you grow. I found that design careers, to a degree, are like a very surreal staircase. When you start out, the steps are very shallow and the risers are very high, because when you're young, you don't know anything, so everything is a learning experience. So in your 20s, as you're graduating and you're leaving school and you're going to work at your first or second job, you learn a huge amount in a very short period of time. And the reason you learn a huge amount is because you don't know that much. So it's easy to learn. Also, you're young, so you retain it, which is even better. So you make a huge leap. And, you know, in this period of time, some of you will find yourselves in fantastic situations of growth, and you may turn into Wunderkinds and invent things and people who know who you are right away. And others of you may feel like you're sort of stuck in the mud and rolling along. It levels out in life. So you might be a Wunderkind, or you might be essentially a Peon. It might be one or the other, but it doesn't matter because you're young anyway and you've got all this time to learn. In your 30s, you're a pro. You put those 10 years together of design experience, and anyway, whatever angle you came from, you are a professional. You know about the business, you know how it works, you know how to make things, you know how to get things done, you know how to be terrific, you know how to be efficient. You're really of use to somebody. That's a great period of time because you actually begin to feel your own professionalism in your work and the fact that you really kind of know what you're doing. So the 30s are great, but if you look at the 30s and you look at the step, the amount of growth is less, and the step is a little longer because you start to get to a reasonable plateau. Then you get to something I call catch 40, and that's an aging pro. An aging pro, for example, if you were in a youth-oriented business when you started, like I was in the music industry, you're suddenly too old for it. Or if you're doing something and you're in your 40s, you're competing with somebody in their 30s. So that has a difference to it. Or you can perceive as being more experienced, which might be good, but you're in this kind of middle gray area that's difficult. And you have to work your way through it. I joined Pentagram in my early 40s simply to make that jump to be able to get better paying jobs and heavier work, because at that point I was an aging pro. But then you get to your 50s, and your 50s are great because you have real power. And the reason you have power is that all the people that you work with in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s are in their 50s, and they have power too. So they hire you. And all of a sudden, you're working within your peer group and doing all kinds of terrific things. That doesn't necessarily mean you grow that much. It just means that you're doing new and different, maybe more powerful things. But if you look at the step level, it's really very shallow, and it's very hard to make growth. And then when you get in your 60s, you've got waning power because you're sort of coming to the end of things here. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, it's just scary as all hell. I'm sort of there now. I'm about to turn 71. It's really scary. So this talk is how I've tried to defy this nightmare. I mean, this is real. I didn't make this up. I looked around for a long time. I look at my peers and my friends and my husband and people who came before me, people who are coming after me, and I can see them all fitting very neatly into this sort of little chart I've made. And the question is, how do you break through it, and how do you defy it? And how do you find a life where you make things and you continue to grow and change and really have a fulfilling life in design? And it is a life, and it's a great one. So here are things I know. They're just some rules that'll help you out. By the way, if you want to take a picture in case you didn't take one, this is where you take it. It'll tell you exactly how it works out if you want to remember your what pratfall not to fall into as you do the unavoiding aging process. So, lesson number 1. Fall in love with something that was designed. If you haven't done it already, see if you can do it. It's very important to remember the moment when you were shocked or inspired by something that was designed. And that I remember my moment. It won't have any resonance for you because you're in a different generation and different culture, but you may relate to it. I fell in love with 3 Beatles covers that came out sequentially in the 60s to the early 70s. This was when I was at Tyler School of Art. First, I was in high school when Revolver came out. That was the first one. And I had never seen anything that was this intricately drawn on a record cover. And I thought it was just fantastic. I loved all the obsession about it and fell in love with it. By the way, the 3 authors, like Klaus Vormann and Peter Blake and the last artist, were all fine artists. None of them are graphic designers. I never knew that till much later. But I fell in love with this cover, and I looked at it for hours. And then only a year and a half later, this came out. And remember, this is pre-computer, so this kind of montage work was quite difficult. And this thing had to be carefully constructed and put together. And we marveled at this thing. We looked at it for hours. We were also all stoned, but that didn't matter. These were the 60s. This was here. This was emblematic of my early days. And I just thought, I'd seen everything there was to see until only a year later, this came out, a cover with nothing on it. And there was what I would call chutzpah, like so much nerve to come right out in your face and say, no, we're not putting anything on our cover. And it was the pacing of them. It wasn't just what was on the cover. It was within that culture at that time. These 3 things came out where you had a surprise, an expectation, and delight, and then all of a sudden you got smacked in the face. And that was wonderful. And I look for things like that when I'm doing work, when I'm creating campaigns. I mean, how can I engage them? How can I shock them? How can that thing work for me as a designer, even though it's never like this? It's just a thing that I hold on to. It's important to have heroes and mentors. You have to have them because you need touchstones, because things change all the time. Technology changes every minute. Cultures change now in ever rapid pace due to technology and communications. Our politics is changing. It's very scary. And then we have the environment. We have all kinds of things we have to deal with. You need to find your foundation and the thing that you go to keep you going, to remember how to be, to remember how you want to feel and think. And I had 2 very important mentors. The first one was my teacher at Tyler School of Art. He was a Polish illustrator named Stanislaw Zagorski. He barely spoke English when he talked to me. Mostly I remember him saying, do over for me better. And that was his forward. But the way he said it was so intimidating that I rushed to do it over for him better. And pleasing him was all I wanted to do. And I had a lot of problems with typography when I was in college. And he said 3 words to me. He said, illustrate with type. And those 3 words gave me my whole career. I mean, everything I've done since has really been based on thinking that way. Like, what can the type be? How can the type talk to people? How can I do this thing? And it came from him. And he did the cream cover when I was in college. He was doing this while he was my teacher. And I thought, wow, it's always great to admire your mentor. My other hero and mentor is my husband, Seymour Quast, who is 17 years older than me. He is 88 years old now. He works every day. He taught me how to work. He was so passionate about what he did and what he made that he infused it in me. And it's important to fall in love with something that was designed, learn from somebody in a way that you never can change, and find somebody who you want to emulate in the way they think about work and life. And that, for me, that was very important. And he, of course, did work that was groundbreaking. He had a studio called Pushpin with Milton Glaser, and they changed the way we saw design. So he was definitely a hero. Lesson number 3, push back against something. This actually will really fuel you. Sometimes it's good to actually hate something that's designed. It's terrific to find a school of design that you want to rebel against, because it forces you to do things you might not do otherwise. And for me, the thing that I pushed back against was the typeface Helvetica. I hated it in school. I thought it was ordinary, boring. I thought it was like cleaning up your room. I thought, why do you want to do this thing? It's so unexpressive. I didn't realize it was actually very beautifully designed and the most perfect neutral face on the planet. But I just hated it because when I was in school, it came in press type and you rubbed it down in the corner of whatever it was you were making an illustration of, and it looked like hell. So when I was in art school, and then later when I was a record cover designer, I put myself in a situation of just never using it. And as a result, I began to look for typefaces that were older and historic and that had more illustrative quality to them and more sensibility to them. And I would draw them by hand sometimes. Like, for example, this was done in 1975. It was a 2-record set from Charles Mingus, it's a terrific jazz album. I didn't like the music then, but now I realize it was kind of amazing. And it was wood type that I really redrew from hand and then got a calligrapher to help me with the things I couldn't draw well. And of course, there was no computers in those days, so everything was, in fact, handcrafted. They'll tell you that graphic design is ephemeral. But if you want to buy this album online, this is what comes up from 1975. So that stuff stays around. It's kind of amazing. This was another album cover for a jazz session. That's another classic session, which I did at CBS Records about 5 years later. Done the same way, redrawn from a classic piece of pipe tobacco packaging that I had purchased in an antique store. I used to buy antique bottles and containers, and I would just copy the typography and redraw it. And this was also something that was a classic album, and I did not appreciate the music when I designed it. It was amazing how ignorant I was. I went to Japan in 1972, and I bought a lot of Japanese woodcuts that I would cut up and reuse, and I was really admiring of how the type was stacked and how they used stamps and seals to convey information. And when I did this project, it was really quite radical because in the times I was designing these covers, mostly album covers had a photograph of the recording artist on it or an illustration, but they were never predominantly typographic, which these became. I would draw things that would be built out of something else. This is pre-Photoshop. This is actually a piece of inlaid wood, and you can see my hand-drawn tissue on the front cover. And this one was also hand-drawn initially and rebuilt as a piece of 15 by 15 piece of leaded stained glass that Leonard Bernstein purchased from CBS to keep. It was backlit. It was really quite magnificent. It was built by a man named Nick Fasciano. And then some of these covers were just pure typography, just straight ahead messaging. This was a 1930s font that I redrew. And that informed a lot of my work in my early years. Later, I worked on a project for a place called the Public Theater, which I still work for. And I have been there, I would say, in-house creative director for 25 years. I wouldn't say in-house is not right because I work at Pentagram, but they are, in fact, a place where I've set up the art department, I design the seasons, and everything that comes out of that place I'm sort of controlling from a distance. And when I got into it, I had gone back to my early love of wood typography and designed a logo for them that was made out of all these weights of wood typography. Here's my original sketch for it. And this is back before we were working on the computer. And I did a series of newspaper ads and promotions for the public in 1994 that were radical. And when people saw them, they recognized the theater right away. Then I made a series of posters, and the posters lived in the streets, some of them. And some of them, they ran out of money, and they didn't put them in the street. They only hung them in the theater, like this one. Over a period of time, the posters were supposed to represent the theater, but where the posters were seen was by the design community because this whole program won a lot of awards and museums began to pick it up and show it. So that people assumed that this thing had a lot of presence, but in fact, the only place you could see this work was in the Public Theater. If you didn't go to the Public Theater, you'd never see it. some of this work did live on the street. The Shakespeare in the Park posters are out every summer, and they promote free Shakespeare in the Park, and the public did see them, but they only saw them once a year, so they didn't have the same kind of impact as if you think about Nike advertising, that they were just not that visible. However, in 1996, and from 96 through about 1999, I did a show called Bringin' the Noise, Bringin' the Funk. And that went from the public theater to Broadway. So there was a lot of money to promote it, and it was actually out in the street, and people did see this. The problem with it was that the theater was not necessarily promoted on most of the advertising, and that in a period of time, what happened was other people in New York in the theater industry started knocking off that poster, and it became a popular style. So that for a period of time, the public theater completely lost its identity because it was subsumed by other graphic designers in New York. I began to change it and try to make it different so it didn't look like the other wood type things that everybody was doing. But actually, even though I liked these posters, they were a failure in promoting the public. Now, the public didn't get angry or fire me, which they probably should have after this, because they were busy making plays and they didn't have any money anyway and seemed to have no expectation of anything. But I realized I wasn't doing my job very well. At one point, I redesigned the identity, so the typeface went from wood type to Accidents Grotesque, and that logo is redrawn in that very Helvetica-like font. And this thing is all very neutral, and we did this for a couple of years, but that didn't catch on either. Then I started changing it every year, which was worse. Then we settled on Knockout. And if you see the newest episode of Abstract, they did one on me in last year, and there's a new one with Jonathan Heffler, and he's showing his font Knockout. And there's a whole dissertation on this. I began working with his font, and I started systematizing it, but after a year it got boring. Then when I was doing the theater lobby, which I redesigned, and at this point in time I was, environmental graphics became half of my work, and I'll take you through that later. I realized that the posters were really more effective in a way when you saw them all collectively, because it was about a mass of programming, and that the individual posters, while memorable in the museum, no one really would ever get to see quite that way. And I thought it would make more sense to design seasons instead of individual plays. So I took a poster from one season that we had designed, and we made a little manual out of it, so that the design department that I hired down in the public theater would have a color system and a typographic system that they would use for everything this theater did, because they didn't just do individual plays. They had Joe's Pub, which was a nightly cabaret that they did posters for shows every night. There's a thing called Under the Radar, which has emerging artists, and there are a number of other programs. And we thought, well, they can do everything collectively, and all these things could connect. And so that the mass of it would be the same as if they had a big advertising budget and could really put all these things on the street. So we began doing this, and it started to work because people began recognizing it. The second year, we did a skewed type version of it. If you look into one of the listings there where it says Winter Solitude, and you go down to about 4, there's a little show called Hamilton. Nobody cared because we weren't doing it that way. And when it went to Broadway, they designed their own show from the theater in their own advertising style, because it was no longer the public show. It was owned by the special producer, but though the public retained a royalty on it. And we found that this worked better than doing the individual production for it, which would have been seen, but then it would have overshadowed all the rest of the work. The following year, I designed something where small typography skewed through something bigger and cut through it. And we realized that if we did it with type, we could do it with photographs. So this became a system for a whole season, and everything was designed in this style. The following year, we made starbursts and blobs, and they created the look of the season. So each year, it was still the same wood type, it was still public theater type, but the sensibility of it would change by a season. This was last year, and it animated because we finally could get space in taxi cabs and on kiosks and subways. So we begun designing animated typography as well as the posters. But after, I think at this point, 24 years of designing for the theater, I actually knew how to do my job. That's how long it took. And sometimes you think you know what you're doing, but you really don't, because you have to live it and see what happens to it. And I know as an identity designer that when somebody goes into a client and tells them they know how this thing is going to live over 25 years, they're lying. You have to live it. You have to know how to adjust for it. And there's this is this season's. You never know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen with the culture, with the economy, and with the technology. And the way people really see this stuff is not on the street like I designed it. It's really an Instagram, because people go to the plays and they take little pictures of it and they show it to each other, and that's how this thing lives. And I would have never known that in 1994 when I started doing that. Who knew what Instagram was? How many of you were alive in 1994? A few. That's good. So the fifth lesson is to be a neophyte. When you're young, it's great because you don't know what you're doing, so you make discoveries. When you get older, you know exactly what you're doing. You don't make any discoveries, so you got to make yourself young again. And the best way to make yourself young is to do something you don't know how to do. Because I had worked for the public theater, and at the point, I think this was about 1998, 99, people started to come to me to design the lobbies of theaters, because I had done the lobby for the public theater, but I didn't really do the environmental graphics yet. I just hung up a bunch of posters there in an early iteration. So here's where I made an amazing discovery. I was given this building that looked exactly like this. This is the New Jersey Performing Arts Center School for actors and actresses in dance and drama and all that stuff. And they wanted me to put some flags in front of it like the public theater. But I thought, well, this building is such a mess, you really got to paint it. It sort of looks terrible. And I persuaded them to paint it, and then they wanted me to hang the flags out, but I thought that would be a little dull. So I discovered the major discovery that I've been using for the next 20 years, which is that if you design something that is designed to be printed or exist on a website, and you make a configuration of type, and you get an approval from a client, it generally will come out somewhat like what you design, because the period between the time you design it to the time it officially runs, the client has a whole pile of opportunities to make changes to it. They may change the copy. They may change the size of the thing, whatever it is you're making. They may decide to cancel the whole thing. But generally what comes out doesn't look like what you originally did. I discovered if you worked on a building, which takes a much longer period to design and is determined by budget, meaning how much it costs to build something, if you get something approved by the client at an early stage and they've decided that there was enough money in the budget to do it, it comes out exactly like your comp, which is great. So I discovered that if you made a Photoshop rendering of a building like this and showed it to them saying, we're going to do all this typography on the building and hang flags on it, it comes out exactly like your Photoshop rendering. Isn't that amazing? Almost every piece of environmental graphics I could, if I showed you the original Photoshop rendering, you'd go, oh my God, it looks just like that. That's because they're too lazy to change it once they approve the budget. If anything happens to it, they just kill the whole project. This is important to know. That's why this is great work. It takes a really long time. It's boring. You know, there's part of it where you're just waiting around. But this was amazing to me. And what was wonderful was I wasn't really sure how to do it. And we kind of made a mechanical of this building. And I hired guys who painted words like flats fixed on the sides of garages in Newark, New Jersey. And this was the best job they ever had. And they got up on the ladder and they would call me and they'd say, hey, Paula, I noticed the spacing between the H and the E isn't right. You mind if I fix it? And they actually fixed it. They made it better. They were fantastic. They were totally into it. This was it being painted. Then I got a pile of schools, because that was essentially a school. You do one thing, you get about 17 of them. And as I said, if you do 3 things, you're an expert. So that all of a sudden you become the person to do that thing. I mean, there was a period of time where there were these schools that the school was talking to you and telling you how to behave and how to feel and sort of elevate you. And that was a fad for a while. And I would work with these union painters, and I would show them my Photoshop rendering, and they would say, oh, lady, you crazy. And but it would come out perfectly because they would get into the job because they were challenged, and it was great. So this was a lot of fun. This was a school in Clinton Hill in Brooklyn. This is a theater that you'll see the materials are going to get fancier. This is a theater in Manhattan on New 42nd Street, and it was the signage, the wayfinding was on the floor because actors and actresses take their cues from the floor, and sometimes they went up on walls. And then the project started to get fancier and more expensive, like Bloomberg's headquarters, which was, something called Bantam, which was a beautiful plastic that was glued to glass, and you could see it through the space. And there was a giant jumbotron where the giant numbers of the stock report were popping up with the sort of report going in smaller type below. And this is where I began to fall in love with discoveries from materiality and budget. This thing was designed originally to be a giant flat jumbotron. We weren't that creative to figure out that it could have space between it, but we had to cut the budget. And then I realized that the type was small enough to read on one band, and the number was big enough that it could read through the whole situation of these things breaking. So if you look at the negative space, that's about $1 million we cut away. And that's how I got it made. Didn't look like the Photoshop rendering, but it looked like the new Photoshop rendering. And then on the stairwell, I did things that had to do with the space, so that the floors at Bloomberg were all different sizes. So I took the tallest floor and made that the size of the number. And then when the floors got lower, I just let the numbers sort of bend around the whole space, which was sort of a nice discovery, which is the fun of working in space, because you don't necessarily totally control it, but you can design right into it. So it has a lot of play. But this work was great for me because I could play with it and I could make breakthroughs. And if I could sell it, they would do it if the money was right. This was gray advertising. We made the word gray out of a neon cube and rendered type into a mesh and built bathroom signs, which were enormous, that were done by projections and changed perspective as you walk through the space. Planned Parenthood was a very political job, and we couldn't show any of the founders of Planned Parenthood because they seemed to all have something politically wrong with them. And we were hired to design a mural for a staircase that would depict their history. So instead of using people, we did it on the history of birth control. And we used small black and white ads they'd made, and then we applied bright colors to them. We built the fly-through that you're seeing here, and now the original. And the thing went up 3 flights of stairs, and it's actually a joy to walk through. The projects became bigger and more civic and completely visible. I was hired by the Bloomberg administration to redo the Rockaways after the Hurricane Sandy had destroyed the beaches and the boardwalk. And for all of New York City beaches, we designed what I would call an emotional sign system. It was designed to tell you what street you were on, but they were designed as a series of posters that had a picture of the beach from where you walk into the beach, so that if you look at these closely, you'll notice all the photos are slightly different. And it was enormously successful because in every neighborhood, everybody felt just devastated that their boardwalk was destroyed because it was part of their community, and that when they looked at the picture of their beach, they sort of felt pride in it. Like just like if you think about how you go to the beach when you were a little kid and you know exactly what it looks like as you enter it. That's what that did. So after that, we were hired again to do the buildings in the neighborhood, these big colored cement blocks that we just painted up, and then the boardwalk. And the boardwalk was made with cement blocks that were 90 feet each individually wide. So that, what's 4 times 90? Is that, I guess it's 3,600 square feet or something. What is that width if it was 4 times 90? It's like 360 square feet, right? I'm bad at math. Always have to have somebody else do it. They had waves on the top. The architect Claire White designed a sort of wavy piece. So we designed this font for it against the structure of it called Rockaway Wide, and it was inlaid into the boardwalk, which you can see when you fly over JFK. Here's like some close-ups of it so you can sort of see the scale. These were all shot from a drone. So there you go. It sort of gives you the sense of it in real life. Doing this sort of work is fantastic. When I run into people who live in the Rockaways, they all know about this. They know I did it. It really touches you because you're infiltrating your community, and you get to be part of it in this way that doesn't go away. Which is why I strongly advocate for this sort of work. I think it's great for graphic designers who are afraid of it. And sometimes these courses aren't offered, but if you have the opportunity to get involved in it and work with an architect and do this sort of thing, you'll find it. It takes a long time, but it was a breakthrough for me. This is recent. This is the Quad Cinema. It's a small jewel box of a theater that has 4 theaters in it. What was wonderful is the word quad could become an awning from the front and the back of the building into the theater. And in this instance, we designed the whole theater. We did all the interior design. We put this series of screens in that are programmed to break different ways for different types of movie productions. See, I don't know if that animates. I guess it doesn't. And then there are 4 theaters in the cinema, and they're all designated by the letters. So you go to the Q, the U, the A, and the D. And if you saw the Photoshop renderings, it looks exactly like this. When I say we, by the way, I'm talking about me and my team. I have 2 teams, 3 and 3, and then a couple of helpers who are interns or as freelancers. And one team is an environmental design team, and the other is a graphic design team. And our environmental design team works on this sort of thing, and the graphic design team works on identities and posters and things that you see that are flat graphics. This is also very recent, just this past year, and this was amazing. With environmental graphics, you really can set the tone for a place in a very significant way. And when you went to old Scholastic's headquarters, they hung up their children's book illustrations sort of as giant printouts, and they looked very tacky. And I was trying to figure out why they looked so bad in their space, and it was because the illustrations themselves were not designed to be that big. And when you blew them up, they got grainy and just weren't handled properly. And I thought, they're really not wallpaper. They really should be objects. They should be things that you see that become precious and become retranslated. So we decided to take the whole building of Scholastic and turn it into an art gallery for children's art. And we used installation style art. We built this magic bookshelf where you can't see how the books are attached. There's no shelves, but they all look like they're sitting on each other, which would be impossible. They're encased and lit. We remade all these covers so they were color coordinated. We turned Harry Potter into Gilbert and George and stuck them on as a stained glass ceiling, and there's light that comes through it. The Magic School Bus is a series of dowels. Captain Underpants comes straight through the wall. My hero, the captain. Another Magic School Bus mural is a lenticular installation with 2 sides. These things were great because when I'm working on both at once, they're such opposite things to do flat graphic design and then go into dimension, to do something that's due in 3 weeks and something that's due in 3 years. It's a great flipping of what somebody was talking about, the monotony of work. And if you want to make your life interesting, first learn, then become an expert, then diversify, because the diversification really does help you grow. I think another thing that helps growth is really finding a personal expression. And I became obsessed with painting these big, large-scale maps. I used to paint them at a small scale, and they were jokes that I made, and I did satire, and they appeared in places like the New York Magazine or even the New York Times when I used to do little illustrations for those places. I haven't even talked about that, but that was a sideline I did in my early days. And one day I was looking at one of the maps I did, and I thought, well, it'll look really great big. These paintings, this particular painting is 14 feet wide by 10 feet high. It takes me maybe 6 months to paint. Everything I can say about the world is on it. Here's India. The colors are motivated by my sense of play in the place. I control my information, so if it doesn't fit, it doesn't go on the map. We've made silk screens of these. I have 2 galleries, one gallery that sells the paintings and another gallery that deals the silk screen. And the galleries were an accident. I had a friend who was a painter who visited me and just took it to his gallery, who then showed them and they started to sell. Then the gallery turned out to be dishonest. The only time I really ever had to sue anybody in my life was this gallery. You know, everybody thinks graphic design is a corrupt profession. Get into the art scene, you'll find some real corruption. And I went to a dealer named Bryce Walkowitz who handles information art, and he's been great. And so he handles the paintings and sometimes commissions for me. And then a guy named Jim Kempner, who's on 23rd and 10th, deals the silk screens. Most of these paintings have been made into silk screens. This was from a recent show. And right now I'm working on a Porsche that's called an art car. That I don't know if they're going to do it or not, but we had to turn one of my maps into a car, and it looks very, very cool, and I'm really excited. You know, I love when the form changes and the thing changes and it's a new thing. And I do these in my weekend house, and I do them in spurts. If I'm having a show, I work really, really hard and get a lot more done. If I'm not having a show, I just sort of mess around. Right now I'm painting hurricanes. Seemed appropriate. Here's Paris, Rome. And these are recent prints as well as paintings. We just made a whole new series of prints. I think there were 6 new ones. Sometimes the fine art, like with the car, overlaps something that's commercial. So here you're looking at me holding up an original painting that became a 2,500 square foot mural. So I was hired not as a graphic designer, but as a fine artist to paint a mural in one of a high school that had a special budget in Queens called Metropolitan High. And there were 3 fine artists up for the commission. But I won the commission because I was a graphic designer and I knew how to make a presentation. And what I did is we instead of saying, oh, yeah, I'll take your space and make a mural out of it, because there was like a long hallway, like, say, a wall like that, I did the whole space. And I did the whole space because I knew how to do it, because I could do a fly-through animation, because that's what I do. So that it was actually a terrific advantage to have one form of design that I do inform this other form of artwork. And the way we did it, here it is going up, is that the painting was repainted by the same person who did some of the painting in the Scholastic job I showed you, a guy I work with who is a craftsman. And we rented space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and if you look very close, like if you look over here and here, you'll see seams from these pieces of a kind of a masonite that we painted on, where the pieces were about 4 feet by 8 feet, and they were screwed into the wall to assemble this mural. And it was a city project, and the city of New York owns it, so it had to be fireproofed, and it had to be able to be removed in case of floods, etc. So it had all these other qualities that I could deal with, because I deal with that on a daily basis in environmental graphics. So here it is completed, and it was 2,500 square feet and went around. There were actually 2 of these. I'm not showing the next one just because it's sort of the same thing. It was a different version in different languages. But they filled these 25 square foot areas, and it was really a lot of fun to do. So then I did something at Tyler when they gave me an exhibit in their gallery where I was asked to involve the students. So I thought, well, it'd be fun to do kind of the same thing and get everybody to participate. So I painted a map of Philadelphia in line, turned it into color. Then we dropped it into this box, that's the 3,000 square foot space that would be the gallery, to see if it worked. Then I broke them up into sheets that were about 1.5 feet by 2 or 3 feet. And 152 students each got one. And they were keyed to a map of Philadelphia. So they were all getting a section of the painting. And the painting was keyed, and you could find that section on Google Maps. You went into Google Maps, and we sort of blew it up with a little diagram of where they'd be, and they were numbered. And they were given a manual, like a real standards manual of how to paint this thing. And what they had to do is they had to take their area and fill it in. And they would fill it in with whatever they wanted to fill it in that related to Philadelphia. And they were given one color, which was blue, and they were given three different paintbrush sizes, and they couldn't go anywhere fatter than the thick line, because otherwise they would knock each other out, because very big, thick lines wouldn't work with thin ones, and it had to be within a certain range so that the line work that made the map held the other stuff together and it didn't look like a mess. So here's the room finished, painted by 152 people. And what was great was this is all paper except for the rug I painted that was the floor in the center. But you see that the paper and the busyness of the mural overcame the molding and the very sort of crappy things that existed in that gallery space, which was really kind of a mess. But the minute you put the mess over the mess, it sort of made its own order, which was kind of terrific. I loved this project. I want to do more of this. It was just so much fun. And people did crazy things. They really got into it. They had their own narrative about whatever place there was, and if they didn't like the place, they'd just say, nothing much going on here. It was all wrong, of course, because all the maps are wrong. You know, like I don't paint anything accurately. But it was wonderful when it happened. It was up for about 3 or 4 months. But this is all paper you're looking at on the walls. It's quite astounding. It's really good to get involved in your local community. You know, it's really hard to change the world, but it's not that hard to make an impact on a block or a neighborhood, because you can. You're a designer. You can make things happen. You can change things. And that very often there's no budget for these things. So that if things are good and you're busy enough and you have enough money and somebody needs some help, do it, because it's great when it's out there, and cities need that kind of support. I make things all the time, like I make posters for political causes and things like that, but I actually don't think they do much to change things. But this did. This was the New York City Parks Department, and I was on the Design Commission for about 6 years, and the city's parks signage was all over the place. It just was a total mess, and they had all these sort of terrible, don't do this, don't do that, negative signs that were kind of in your face and broken. And I gave them a system, and it took 7 years for them to finally implement it all, but it's in 1,900 parks in New York City, and I feel great about that because it cleaned up a big mess. And this isn't my most creative piece of work. It's actually Helvetica on a grid, sort of, what I hate. But on the other hand, I could do it, and that's terrific. You have that ability, and that's part of your responsibility as designers, is if something's broken, fix it. You can. And it doesn't cost you money. This project was amazing. There were a group of women who were lawyers, and they're changing the law about menstruation because women in the United States pay taxes on their tampons and Kotex and whatever it is they're buying, and men don't on things like prophylactics. It's been a completely discriminatory system all over the United States. And 2 women, one of whom I know, came to me with this project, and it was called Menstrual Equality, and I thought that was the most disgusting name. I thought, no one wants to get behind that. That's too depressing. So we changed their name to Period Equity, and we gave them an identity and some very professional-looking materials, and they've been going around the country lobbying. They've changed 22 states, and this is a thing. And it was a gift. You can do this because you can. And it took really it doesn't take much time when you know how to do it. And it's fun. I'm sure you can do this. This is the easiest thing to do. Hang around with smart people. You don't want to be the dumb one. It's okay to be the dumb one. You don't want to be the smartest person in the room. You don't learn anything. You want to be with people who inspire you, who you learn from, who you trade ideas with, who you trust. You make your community that way. And that you might find that people that you knew in childhood sometimes are not the same kind of people you want to know later, just simply because you move into a different direction. Find your peers. Make your subset. I was lucky because it happened to me twice. When I joined CBS Records, this is the CBS Records art department. There I am, and the little Paula in the middle is about a 25-year-old girl there. And all the people I worked with were really great designers. They were really inspiring, and I learned so much from being in that art department. And now I'm in a group with even more people. This is Pentagram, this is my partners, and they're all amazing. All of the partners are amazing. Pentagram is a really unusual cooperative. Every designer runs their own team. They have their own clients. We take all of our money, we put it in the center, we share profit equally, and we all draw the same salary. And we're so intimidated by each other, nobody wants to fail, and that keeps the business up. But it's great to like your partners, and it's great to compete with them. And it keeps things interesting. And I see one of my partners do something terrific, and I go, oh God, I got to do better, And that's good because it keeps me awake. That's what keeps you going. So this has been great for me. Okay, this is the hardest piece of advice. You got to do what you do best, but change with the times. And you have to find somewhere within you the core of who you are and how you approach things. But you can't ignore the culture. You can't say, oh, what I do is timeless. Nothing is timeless. Everything exists in its time. And that you need to change along with the times without giving something away. But I wanted to see what I did and how I did it. And I can see it in the work, and it really does roughly fall into decades. At CBS Records, when I was in my 20s, I was really what I would call a conceptual art director. I worked a lot with typography, but I made things that were also just pure art direction. I bought photography for jazz albums. These were all for Bob James. They're kind of classics now from a whole series of albums he had on a label called Tappan Zee Records. I work with the best photographers in the business. This is Richard Avedon shooting Johnny and Edgar Winter, and I was doing this work when I was in my 20s. It was incredible. Bruce Springsteen gave me this photograph from his butcher. His butcher took it. It was a Polaroid. We kind of retouched it and blew it up and stuck the typewriter type on it. But these are things that were part of my life when I was very young, and I was at the heart of my culture at that particular period of time until I became an aging pro. And some of the illustrators were just wonderful. This was Phil Hayes, an amazing illustrator on the West Coast. I loved this work. And, they were big. They weren't stupid little CDs. They were big 12 3/8 by 12 3/8 albums. Some of them opened up. They all had liner notes. They all had stuff in them. I didn't even think about it. And then I always hated this damn thing. I just always hated it. I was in my kitchen a year and a half ago, and I was chopping an onion, and I was listening to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. I don't know if you know that show with Peter Sagal, who tells fake stories, and the audience has to guess which is the true story, or the guest has to guess that. And he was telling a story about the Earth blowing up and a bunch of spaceships leaving the Earth. And he said, like the Boston cover. I did this cover in 1976. It's 2019 or 18 whenever I heard that story, and I thought, my God, this stuff doesn't go away. And I'll just be humiliated by it for the rest of my life. In the 80s, I was really a postmodernist. At that point in time, the sort of historical work I had done had become fashionable, and I did a lot of it. And I had done this Best of Jazz poster in 1979, and it was critically acclaimed, and it was the first thing I've gotten into MoMA. And I did, still music business posters that were based on political posters, or I did a self-promotion piece for my new business, which were famous novels designed, first paragraphs designed in the style and period in which the novels were written. And these were things that I had begun doing at CBS Records that I carried into my own work for a period of years. Manhattan Records was the same thing. It was really taken from Broadway boogie woogie. In fact, I had to get a permission from MoMA to use the painting, and I could never use the exact painting, so we moved the squares around and had a lawyer look at every square to make sure they didn't line up in any way, shape, or form. I used to find these things in my underwear because you had to cut them out by hand then. There were no computers. And I made funny charts and parodies and things that would, sort of fake data. And these are things that you would consider postmodernism. And then, of course, there was the Swatch Watch poster that I really, everybody was furious at me for this. And sort of the criticism went on for years and years and years. And I still read nasty things about it wherever I go. In the 90s, I was a typographic expressionist. I began to do things with typography that were directly related to subject matter and were not jokes. They were more about spirit and feeling. This was a poster for a silk screener called the Big A, and what I did is to make the A as big as I could. In the technology of the moment, I blew it up on the Xerox machine and had it silk screened. This was for the School of Visual Arts, and it was my first subway poster, and somebody got out at every stop and blacked out the forefinger of Winston Churchill. It was fantastic. My first interactive piece of work. This I showed you. This was everywhere in New York City. And this was as well. This was a poster for a ballet company called Ballet Tech. I did a lot of arts organization work all through my career, and it's always been terrific, that work. Posters for shows. This was actually hanging in the Louvre for a period of time next to the original, which I loved. That was wonderful because you can read that piece of artwork just with the legs. In the 20s, in the 2000s, what do you call those? The 2000s. I never knew what that was called. I was a minimalist. It was really after 9/11. Everything got black and white. Everything got very clean. I got very fancy projects. I did them very simply. There were a pile of them. They came out one after another. And I wasn't working like this early. If you notice, the work is much more modernist. This I actually designed twice, once in the 2000s and then in the teens. But you'll notice a certain kind of minimalism in everything. And the High Line, which I designed in 2001. I even did a series of posters in black and white for sale that I liked very much. They were silk screens. They were very minimalistic. It was part of this whole way I worked for a specific period of time, and now it's much more mixed. So in the past decade, I would describe myself as a visual language designer because we got so advanced with typography with the computer that really every font is drawn. Everything becomes a complete visual language. I'll show you what I mean. I use pro bono projects to develop how I'm going to move forward. And I do it always at periods where I'm bored. And I wanted to see if you could recognize form as the same thing, even if it changed, if it was done by a bunch of people with specific rules, and how far could you stretch it and have it be the same thing. So I took a book and a promotion program for the Type Directors Club, and I gave it to 12 people at Pentagram with the notion that they would take a T, a D, and a C, and they couldn't use any circles, and they could zigzag the configuration of the letter form and the way the outline worked around each one, and there were no laws about whether that or not they filled it in, and how many different ones could they do where you'd recognize it as coming from the same family, which is really the way we sort of design type now, if you think about it. And then it became the program for TDC, and we did millions of pieces on it. But it also became the basis for how I began working in that decade. Like, here's how we redesigned Jasmine Lincoln Center, because you could recognize it much faster just by filling in the letter forms and making them all circles with squares inside. The reason it was designed that way was because I once asked Wynton Marsalis, who was the head of Jazz at Lincoln Center, when we were designing the identity, I said, what's jazz? And he said, it's syncopation. And I said, what's syncopation? He says, it's when you got a bunch of things and one thing is off. That's what type is. If you the minute you fill it in, you made it syncopated. And he handed me the whole logo just in the statement. Most of my clients do. If you ask them the right questions, they'll tell you what to design, and they don't even know it. But that became that program. This is the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'm sure you guys know this. It's right on the corner. And this should animate also, but there you go. It's got 1 million A's. We just made 1 million A's for it, and they can replace them or use them, and use different ones on different shows. And we're still working on that. The Gary hallway is opening soon. It's really exciting. This is House. It's a little online sort of furniture, home decorating thing that's the biggest in the world. It's quite amazing. And it has a little language, and everything's cut and cropped and angled, and the illustration has a language attached to it. And it's a manual. We make a lot of manuals and give them to people, and they make this stuff. Sometimes they make it right, sometimes they don't. This is Expedia Group. They own all Expedia companies, which are mostly travel agents, and we wanted to connect them. So here's where a typographic language really works. If you look at the E, you'll find that when you repeat it with a lot of typography, you can recognize this company without a logo. And that's sort of what I've been doing with typography really for about the past 10 years, is sort of creating the form first, and the form becomes the way you recognize the place, as opposed to just having a logo. Or there's a methodology. Like here in the Library of Congress, this thing can break up all different kinds of ways, and it can handle all kinds of photographs. It can become copy for shows, but it has to do with the insertion of other information that makes you recognize it. And probably, I think the best one was Parsons, which I did now 4 or 5 years ago, where we made this large and thin typeface that the letter forms were extended or contracted, and that collectively you could recognize this thing without a logo. And they're still adding weights to the font, and we're still working on it. There were all kinds of things that were outdoors that the students helped me with. And this is the most recent thing, which is the donor signage on their elevator in the lobby, all made with that typography. And I still do this work now, and I'm trying to figure out what the next decade's going to be about. But it keeps me on my toes. I'm going to have to do some more invention and throw out some things I've been relying on. But, it's always fun. Thanks. Want to put the lights on? Do we have time for Q&A, or how are we on time?
Well, I think we're okay. So first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for the extra time just for focusing on graphic design. We don't get enough of that around here, so we appreciate it. So do you guys have any questions from the audience, or it's a less formal atmosphere, so if you want to ask Paula anything, this is time to do it.
You can ask anything. I have no shame. Really? Okay, that's good. Go ahead.
Who was the worst client that you've had to design anything for?
Boston. I'm teasing. Actually, they were bad. I'm trying to think of the ones I fire, and there are a lot of them. I think there's like one horror a year. Sometimes they misbehave, and I get mad at them, like they won't make a decision. And what I don't like is that when you figure out, if you're running a business, you figure out what something's going to cost. Usually you're making an estimate against a period of time. And so that when you talk to them at the beginning, they say, well, we want this thing to launch in 4 months or 6 months or a year, whatever they say. And you're figuring out the amount of time you're going to have to spend doing it to make a good guess on it. You create a proposal and you sign the proposal, and that's the deal. But I've got clients that will make itty-bitty little changes, and the thing never comes out, and the thing's hanging around the studio for about a year, and I want to kill them. They really are annoying, and they don't understand that they're affecting the way the business runs. So that's really where I get very angry with them. Or they make stupid changes, or they're sloppy, or they fire somebody and they don't replace the person, and you don't know what, all kinds of things happen in working with them, and those are the frustrations of working with clients. It's hard for me to to mention a horrible one, not because I'm being coy, but like I really have the capacity to wipe them right out of my head. Because if you sit on that stuff, it makes you miserable. Those are the kinds of things that make you hate being a designer. Now I'm trying to remember who it was. My senior designer at one point, Lisa Kitchenberg, I can't remember who the client was, but she didn't want to work with them anymore because she said, they make me hate design. That's like the saddest thing in the world, that to have a client, but they can do that. And as I said, I block it, so I don't even remember who it was, which is terrible, but I have a couple right now I'd like to kick out. Yes?
What is the most crucial difference between working in space and or in 2D? Like, difference between environmental design and maybe designing a poster?
Time. You design a poster in a day, you design something for a building, it can take a year to 5 years. I've been working at the Philadelphia Museum of Art now, and it barely moves like a snail's pace, but I've been working with them since 2012. My God. You put the plans in that early, it goes on, you could be dead by then. I think it's very optimistic of me to take those jobs, frankly. You don't know how long you're going to live. But they really are slow. As a matter of fact, Gary said, because he came for the opening when they sort of opened the area, he says, finish this job. Like there isn't a lot of time left for him. So that was his viewpoint. I don't blame him. I mean, it is amazing the how slow architecture moves. And that you are designing things very early in signage, because if you have anything that lights up, you've got to get it into the lighting plans, which are done at the very beginning of the project. So you're really solving the project way in front of it. These things like Bloomberg I started it in 2002 and it was finished about 2006. So that was 4 years. And it was mammoth because it was a whole office building. Scholastic we did in 2 years because it didn't really have any mechanics in it. It was really hanging things on the wall. I mean, the one thing we had to do was build into the stained glass thing into the lobby. That took a little longer, but it's a much faster turnaround. Painting a building is fast, but it's the time frame that changes them. Yes.
You showed us all these different kind of like eras that you've designed in, and the rule that you associated that with was to keep yourself in your work while changing with the times. What do you see in all of those different eras that is the same? What is the part of your style that you put into all of these very different visual ways?
I'm illustrating with type. That's all really what's going on. Just different ways. Yeah.
How do you convince somebody out of doing something really stupid? Like, say your business is about snakes and they only want to use pandas for their branding. How do you convince them out of that kind of decision?
Well, that is dumb, huh?
How do you?
Why would they want to use pandas?
I don't know.
That's the first thing I would say. Why a panda? And if they say why not, I'd make a really long, skinny panda and give it to them. Probably be good.
How do you deal with pentagram, work emails, text, phone calls when you're in Connecticut and supposed to be painting?
That's an excellent question. On Fridays, I really have to look. That's the problem. On Saturday and Sunday, my teams don't email me. But and the clients, I just leave till Sunday night. So that's okay. But what?
You made a rule.
I have had my coordinators put an X in the calendar and just say I'm not available. They don't say where I am. They don't, it's just I could be traveling. I could be going someplace on business. I have meetings all day. They don't know. And I just drew an X in the calendar, because if I didn't do that, it would get filled in. And when I first started doing it, it was getting screwed up all the time. But then I held it. That's really all you have to do. But on Friday, my team is working, and I do work with them. And I need them to be working. Yes.
When you're looking at your work, how do you determine what very small details matter and what are just sort of a symptom of staring at one thing for too long?
I try not to stare at one thing for too long. I once worked with an art director at Time Inc., and you would hand him an illustration And he would put the thing on a coffee table and put his head in his hands, and he'd look at the thing for about an hour. And I would think, what could he possibly be seeing? You can't, I mean, nothing takes an hour. So that, if you're looking too long, you're probably seeing things that aren't really there. I think that you design first as impression, as bold strokes, to sort of create a narrative. Like if you took the panda analogy, it's not ridiculous to make a panda as a snake if you wanted to. And then, okay, you have that idea, then you have to make it work. And there are things that read as panda and things that read as snake, and you'd have to figure out how you put that together to make it work. Then there are the details of it, like the line weight. And you start with the macro and get down to the micro. And that within that, you'll make enough refinements. And most of the work we do on the team goes pretty much that way.
I think we have time for one more question. Paul has an event tonight, so.
Oh, the changing. I get to change my clothes. That's great.
I was
Okay.
given instructions.
But yeah, you're right. You're right. Okay.
So when you're working with your team, you probably have like your right hand person that you go to. How do you decipher who goes to what meeting, who talks to what client, who gets this thing, who gets that opportunity? Because as a chief creative, you can't be everywhere.
Well, that's not totally true. I mean, the thing is that the team is close. I have hierarchical structures. I have an associate, which is the highest position on my team. His name is Jeff Close. And I have an associate, the highest position on the environmental team. His name is Rory Sims. And there are two people that work with him and with me. There's a middle woman named Emily Atwood, who would be, if Jeff left, she'd probably move up and become the associate, and then a younger designer that she can oversee and that Jeff oversees that works on those individual projects. All the initial client contact is initially with me, and pretty much till we sell it. Once the client has committed to making the thing, then the team begins to step in and take it over. And they're doing the secondary and tertiary and completing the job. But I have to be involved in the middle because I have to know, I can't sell something that I don't know how it got that way. So I have to be involved and see it to the point that I make the presentation. Now, we'll come in with 3 ideas generally. It could be 3 to 5. It really depends upon how many we generate. I usually have an idea right away. It's a sketch and somebody doesn't, and I don't have any more ideas. Then they start having ideas and we refine those and we try to make the strongest presentation. And then whatever is sold at that point, they can begin to take it. And they're dealing with the next person down on that thing. Like if you're working with a large corporation, you're working with the president of the corporation and the chief marketing officer, and then it may go down into their in-house art or marketing position. At that point, they're talking directly to Jeff. And people tend to talk to the people at the same level within the organization because that's the best way to make it work right. But I have to stay close to it because things can get very screwed up. And not because of the team, because of the client. So I just have to always know what's going on because I have to go back and fight it back through. One more and that's it. Okay.
So with us young designers, we oftentimes see type as something that's so structured and concrete and often really intimidating. How do you approach type in a way that keeps it new and fresh and fluid?
Oh, God, I think that this is such an incredible time for typography. And that I don't know where you're looking, but there's so many beautiful fonts that are drawn. And so many of my students and my team, there was a program called Type at Cooper where everybody's learning how to draw the font and program it. And we design logos and make them turn into typefaces. It's incredible. So that it's expressive, it's form. You can think of it like illustration, but play with it. It's fantastic. And get the right software and learn how to make it.